What's going on, Packer fans? Welcome back to the Pack a Day podcast. I am your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. I couldn't let the offseason pass without talking about everyone's favorite offseason topic this year at least one more time. And that, of course, is the wide receiver position. And the reason I wanted to discuss this and go over this is because I still see out on Twitter and various other places the conversation and the comments about, well, Julio Jones is still out there, Odell Beckham, Will Fuller, etc., etc. Packers could still add a big-time wide receiver. And let me just say this, the Packers have an open roster spot that is available right now, and it would not shock me in any way, shape, or form if the Packers added a wide receiver prior to the start of training camp. It's just not exactly what you're thinking. Let me explain. So I wholeheartedly believe, and if you are hoping for Julio Jones or a big-time wide receiver to sign with the Packers in the next week, I'm doing everything in my power to reverse psychology this into existence, and hopefully you can throw it in my face. But I wholeheartedly believe that the Packers are not going to add another top-tier wide receiver, which is really just Odell Beckham or Julio Jones. There's like the only two real ones left, right? I do not believe they will add either of those two players prior to the start of training camp, or even, like, I would say even probably prior to the start of the season. If so, maybe it's like the last week or something like that, but probably injuries would have played a part at that point. I just don't see them going in that direction. And the reason I say that is because I just absolutely believe that Green Bay is going to want to see what they have in their current wide receiver group before jumping to any major conclusions and trying to make any major addition to the roster. And I believe that for a couple of reasons. The first is I believe that there could be enough question marks at wide receiver in a good way that the Packers just want to see, hey, let's see how this plays out. And what I mean by that is, what happens if Allen Lazard getting the opportunity at number one actually shows out and looks pretty darn good as a number one wide receiver? What if Sammy Watkins actually looks like the former top pick in the draft, or like one of the top picks in the draft, like in his this year's Devondre Campbell, and completely breaks out and finds his niche within this Packers offense? What if that happens? What if Christian Watson or Romeo Doubs are immediately impact players for this team? What if Amari Rodgers takes a step? What if Randall Cobb, comes back looking just as good as he did prior to his injury a season ago? The odds that all of those answers are yes are very slim. The odds that maybe one of them or two of them could legitimately be true would lead me to believe that Green Bay is going to want to see all of these wide receivers in action to feel like, all right, we've got Dillon and Jones at running back, Tunyon's coming back at tight end. If a couple of these wide receivers just sort of outperform expectations, we're good. The difference between a couple of those things coming to fruition in a Julio Jones or an Odell Beckham may not actually be that great and may not actually be worth the money of investing in that position anymore. The other reason I wholeheartedly believe that to be true is I know that, GMs will look at the roster, right? And right now, you are hard pressed on this team, on this Packers team, to not keep 7 wide receivers barring an injury, right? And there are people in my comments below and on Twitter and on other people's pages. I was listening to a Pack's What She Said episode, and there was comments about Juwan. There are so many commenters about Juwan Winfrey, like, oh, Juwan Winfrey's not getting any respect. He's going to make the team. How? Barring an injury, no disrespect to Juwan Winfrey, how is he getting on the 53-man roster? Because I am not a math major. I'm a history major, if you would like to know, but I am not a math major. But barring something crazy happening or an injury, Allen Lazard is making the team. Sammy Watkins is making the team. Obviously you've got Randall Cobb. He's not going anywhere. Doubs and Watson are making the team. And then you've got Amari Rodgers, a former third-round pick. I would be shocked if they gave up on him. He would have to just be abysmal, and I mean abysmal, this offseason to not keep him around. So Amari Rodgers making this team. And then that leaves Samori Toure as your potential 7. Aaron Rodgers already said, in a quote, that he's got some interesting stuff to him. Juwan Winfrey's your 8. By the way, Malik Taylor has been a 53-man roster guy the last couple years as well. You have 9 guys, in my opinion, of your 10 players on your roster that will at some point be on 53-man rosters this season. Whether that's they start on the practice squad and they get signed later in the season due to injuries, whether that's they get claimed by other teams and they get on the 53-man roster that way, I don't know. But I believe that there will be 9 wide receivers that are currently on this roster that end up on a 53. So what happens if all of a sudden tomorrow they sign Julio Jones? All right, you're keeping Julio, you're keeping Lazard, you're keeping Cobb, you're keeping Watkins, you're keeping Dobb, you're keeping Watson, you're still probably keeping Amari. So now you're just cutting, Samori Toure immediately. And I can already hear some of you in thinking and going, all right, Andy, that's all fine and well. But if I have to cut Juwann Winfree and, Samori Toure and Malik Taylor in order to get Julio Jones, sign me the heck up. And I totally understand where you're coming from. Just know that that's generally not how GMs think. They're going to look at their current roster and be like, we're 9 deep at wide receiver when it comes to rosterable players. And we want to see how some of these guys perform before making an addition. Now, maybe if training camp comes and preseason comes and it's just clearly obvious that none of these rookies are ready, Amari hasn't taken a step, and they're just going to have to do something different. Maybe at that point, if a Julio is still out there, maybe they start having those conversations, right? But I cannot fathom a situation where prior to training camp, they're going to go out and add another receiver to this roster just because you're ultimately setting some guys up for success. If they had Julio, if I'm Juwann Winfree, Malik Taylor, etc., I'm saying like, you got to release me now. I want to go to another team. There is clearly no chance that I am making a 53-man roster here. You're going to have to get rid of me. So I just don't see Brian Gutekunst going in that direction. Remember, money is still very tight, both now and in the future. I know they freed up some money, but they're going to have enough money to put together the practice squad and sign guys throughout the course of the season. I just would be very, very shocked if they went in that direction. Now, I did mention that I think there could be an opportunity that Green Bay adds a wide receiver prior to the start of training camp. They have an open roster spot. The reason I think that is I think they could add a very low tier wide receiver, probably somebody that none of us have ever heard of. And the reason I say that is a lot of what I just discussed, because Juwann Winfree and Malik Taylor are, again, I don't know how you can create a path to them making the roster barring a bunch of injuries, right? If I were the agent for either Malik Taylor or Juwann Winfree and they get cut at the 53-man roster countdown, and assuming they don't get claimed by another team, I would be aggressively telling them, hey, go to another team that doesn't have 7 wide receivers that made their active roster, because you're just not going to have the opportunities. There's going to be a handful of teams that probably only keep 5 wide receivers on their active roster. I want to go to one of their practice squads, because now if an injury happens, you're for sure getting called up because you're not going into a game with only 4 wide receivers. So your odds of getting called up and actually getting playing time are much greater. And you could end up in a situation where you keep your 7 wide receivers and Malik Taylor and, Juwann Winfree thinking the exact same way that I'm saying right now, are like, all right, there's no avenue in Green Bay, go to a different team with less wide receivers. All of a sudden, the only guy left on the roster is a Danny Davis, who, I guess makes the practice squad by default, which is fine. You have 7 guys on the active roster in that situation. You'll be okay. But you probably would just like another developmental player on the roster in case something like that comes to fruition and you want a couple wide receivers on your 16-man roster. So if they add a wide receiver in the coming weeks, I wholeheartedly believe that it will be more of a developmental, maybe practice squad wide receiver than a Julio Jones-esque wide receiver. And again, you guys are just going to throw this in my face aggressively, and rightfully so, if all of a sudden they sign Julio or someone like that in the next week or so. The one situation where maybe you could talk me into it, maybe, and I still would be shocked, is if they signed Odell Beckham knowing that he was going to have to start on the PUP list anyway, right? So you put him on the non-football injury list and then you put him on the PUP list. So he doesn't affect your active roster until he's ready to play well down the course of the road. And then at that point, of course, you're going to have injuries at wide receiver that are going to happen, or other positions, and you can add him when he's ready to play. You could maybe talk me into that scenario. If I were Odell Beckham, though, I'm going to wait till I'm 100% healthy, see how the season progresses, and make sure that Aaron Rodgers or whatever team that I'm going to has a healthy quarterback and healthy situation. There's no need for him to make that determination or decision right now. Heal your ACL, get better, and then make it a bidding war between all the playoff teams of who's going to get Odell Beckham later in the season. So I just can't find a really good situation or scenario where Green Bay would sign a Julio, a Beckham, a Fuller prior to the start of camp, and even really probably until the season starts, barring a massive group of injuries to the wide receiver position. However, that gets us to our main topic of today, and that is, while I don't think Green Bay is going to add a wide receiver now, as we get into the season, whether it be via injury or Aaron Rodgers just is like, hey guys, I appreciate what you did. You went out and got 3 draft picks at wide receiver. You signed a free agent in Sammy Watkins. I know you just didn't, sit and keep the guys that were here. You went out and made some aggressive moves to improve this position, but the 3 rookies just aren't ready yet. Sammy Watkins is either hurt again or he's not performing the way that maybe we thought he would. And all of a sudden, because of that, and maybe Amari hasn't taken a step, and Rodgers is like, hey, it's great to have Tonyan back. It's great to have Lazard and Cobb, but that's all I'm working with here. And yeah, I've got good running backs. Jenkins and Bakhtiari are back on the O-line. I feel good about that, but I got to have something more, concrete that I can trust than just Cobb and Lazard. And midway through the season, near the trade deadline, if the rookies haven't clicked, if Amari hasn't clicked, if Sammy Watkins hasn't clicked, at that point, clearly Green Bay could be a wide receiver away from a legitimate Super Bowl contending team. That's a real possibility. So if that situation comes to fruition, or you just have injuries, I do believe that Green Bay could be aggressive around the trade deadline of adding a wide receiver. And you should note that the most traded position within a week of the trade deadline since 2010 has been wide receiver and linebacker. So both of them have had 12 trades within a week of the trade deadline since 2010. Number 1 amongst any positions, again, wide receiver and linebacker. So we have seen a variety of wide receivers traded around the trade deadline. Most recently, Emmanuel Sanders for the 49ers, who helped propel them and get them to a Super Bowl that season. So that's within the realm of possibility. As I mentioned, there could also be an Odell Beckham scenario where, again, around the trade deadline or maybe a little bit after, Beckham gets healthy and says, hey, I'm healthy, I'm ready to go. All right, I see Green Bay, I see Tampa Bay, I see the Rams again, I see maybe, whatever, all of the AFC West. I see these teams that are ready to compete, maybe a Kansas City. Like, all right, what team do I think is the best? All right, KC with Mahomes, Green Bay with Rodgers, go back to Stafford and the Rams. Like, I could make a couple decisions there. What's the best scenario where I think I can win a Super Bowl, and who's going to give me the most money? Then maybe Green Bay gets involved in the conversations at that time. That could be one potential in-season addition, but they could go the trade deadline route as well. And clearly, as we're looking at potential trade scenarios, you got to think it's going to be from a team that would be floundering by that point. So you're looking at bad teams that have a good wide receiver. Maybe that's towards the middle or end of their contract that could be tradable. So here are just a few names that I think could maybe be in play for the Packers if they did, in fact, feel like they needed to attack the wide receiver position around that time. The first is Corey Davis, Jets wide receiver, former Titans wide receiver. The Jets have spent some pretty impressive draft capital the last few seasons at wide receiver. Garrett Wilson, Elijah Moore, and Denzel Mims. They also still have Braxton Berrios, who's a really nice wide receiver as well. If they get to the trade deadline and that team is not competing, Corey Davis very much could be in play, both for the Jets in trading him away, but for the Packers in potentially being interested in Corey Davis. Remember, he has the relationship with Matt LaFleur from their time in Tennessee together. And you could make an argument that while he has never really lived up to expectations, he's never had a great situation or scenario either. You get him with Aaron Rodgers, and that changes everything for Corey Davis. Now, the hurdle here to get over is that he is, even at the trade deadline for the remainder of the season, he would be due about $6.9 million for the remainder of this year. That is a lot of money for a Corey Davis. I don't see Green Bay going in that direction. They would basically be a one-year rental. They're not going to pay him what he would be due next year. There would be no cap hit next year. But I think what would have to happen here, even for the Jets to trade him at all or get any value in return, they would have to move some of his money to a signing bonus so that the Jets would eat that cap hit rather than the team that would trade for him. So maybe Green Bay could get that down to like $3 or $4 million, which would make it much more palatable. And then maybe the Jets are able to get a 5th or 6th round pick in return for a Corey Davis at that point. So the issue, Davis has only played one full season in his entire career, which was 2018. Last year, he only played in 9 games, had 34 catches, 492 yards, and 4 touchdowns. Even the best season of his career was only 65 catches, 891 yards, and 4 touchdowns. So You could argue that, even if they go in that direction, maybe that's not exactly the missing piece. Again, you'd probably be looking at, is Aaron Rodgers the player that could maybe release Corey Davis and get the most out of him? Green Bay would have to think so. He's a good blocker, knows Matt LaFleur's system. There could be something there, but the Jets are going to have to probably eat a bit more of that salary cap, and Davis would have to probably be having a pretty good season at that point to make it palatable for a team to trade for him. The next one is not the sexiest name in the world, and he's getting a little bit up there in age, to say the least, but that's Marvin Jones for the Jaguars. The nice aspect of this is he's only due $3.2 million remaining on his deal at the time that you would trade for him. So a very palatable contract to take on. He would be a free agent next year, so this would be a 1-year rental. It's probably not going to cost much in draft compensation. You're probably looking at like a 6th round pick or maybe a conditional 7th, something like that. And you look at Marvin Jones, and again, it's maybe not the most sexy name in the world, but last year, 73 catches, 832 yards, and 4 touchdowns in a not great scenario. And the year before that, 76 for 978 and 9 touchdowns. He continues to perform at a high level. If all of a sudden he's having a really nice season and the Jaguars aren't in contention, he could be a name that there is actual value for around the trade deadline. Does that move the needle enough? Is that going to be the missing piece at the wide receiver position? Maybe not to probably not, but it could be a nice addition that still helps out. And if all those other things that I said earlier, where the rookies just aren't hitting, Amari's not hitting, Sammy Watkins didn't hit, or you just need players to fill in for injuries, Marvin Jones may not be the worst scenario in that case. Next up could be Robbie Anderson. Now this one's a little bit more complicated. He would be less than $1 million on this year's salary cap, but there is a ton of dead cap for Carolina to take on. So in all likelihood, Robbie Anderson would have to be struggling kind of like he did last year. And the Panthers would just have to say, all right, we're done. We're just going to take the sunk cost. And if we can even get a 6th or 7th round pick for Robbie Anderson, we're willing to take it, even if we have to eat a ton of the deal. Last year was a massively disappointing season for Anderson. 53 catches, 519 yards, and 5 touchdowns, but only a 48.2% catch percentage. But 2020, just 2 years ago, was phenomenal. 95 catches, 1,096 yards, only 3 touchdowns. But again, he wasn't in the best scenario. He was a really good player that year with a 69.9% catch percentage. If he starts playing a little bit closer to that, maybe if you're Green Bay, you make an offer that's a little bit more aggressive, but you're probably going to have to pay more than you want because Carolina just have to take so much in dead money in that scenario. So a little bit tough, but not totally out of the realm of possibility. Another one that is very, very tough and maybe out of the realm of possibility, but at least worth mentioning here, Tyler Lockett. He would also have a ton of dead cap for Seattle and probably too much guaranteed salary remaining for Green Bay to be able to take him on into the future as well. It's tough to see this one work. He's going to be 30 years old this season, but just last year, 73 catches, over 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns. In 2020, 100 catches, over 1,000 yards and 10 touchdowns. He's got 3 straight seasons of at least 70 catches, at least 1,000 yards, and at least 8 touchdowns. Phenomenal route runner. Seattle could be thinking, all right, we've already moved on from Wilson. The timeline for us competing does not match up with the timeline of keeping Tyler Lockett on this team. They're within like the realm of thinking of like, listen, it's already a sunk cost. We've already given him a ton of guaranteed money. If we can get a decent pick in return, it's going to take something aggressive in order to make that happen. But maybe Seattle takes a 3rd round pick for Tyler Lockett at the trade deadline. Likely, no. Probable, no. Impossible, probably not. But that would be a huge get for the Packers around the trade deadline. Another one that's in a similar, probably not circumstance, but maybe not totally out of the realm of possibility. Deontay Johnson for the Pittsburgh Steelers would only be owed about $1.5 million at the trade deadline remaining. The issue is he's a free agent next year, which means he would be a rental in almost all scenarios at that point. You could franchise him, but that gets really, really tough. The Steelers would have to be bad. Johnson would probably have to be good enough, but not good enough where they feel like they're going to sign him to a huge deal and they know they're not going to franchise him. Even in that scenario, they could feel like, hey, if he leaves in free agency, we're going to get at least a 3rd round comp pick for him in the worst case scenario. So you're going to have to give us at least a 3rd round pick, if not more. And you might need to, give some players in that situation as well. Maybe like a 2nd or 3rd round pick and like an Amari Rodgers for Deontay Johnson at the deadline could make some sense if Pittsburgh knows they're not going to be able to retain him. But that's a lot for an 8 or 9 game rental. But if Brian Gutekunst would feel like it could be the player that puts him over the top, maybe they could go in that direction. He's only 25 years old. Maybe Gut gets a little bit crazy and tries to re-sign him next year and make him kind of the future of the wide receiver group. That'd be a really tough deal to pull off. And like just the exact right scenario would have to happen. But again, maybe not out of the realm of possibility entirely. By the way, he had 107 catches for over 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns in his breakout season a year ago. One more name I'll give you, Jarvis Landry. He would have less than $1 million due at that point. This past year only played in 12 games, 52 catches, 570 yards, and 2 touchdowns. The prior year, 72 for 840 and 3 touchdowns. You can see he's been on the decline. If Green Bay really wanted Landry, they could have signed him this offseason. They didn't go in that direction. So I can't imagine they'd be super inclined to go that way. But maybe he's having a really nice season with the Saints, but the Saints just are struggling and not in playoff contention, I should say. And if that's the case, maybe Green Bay makes an offer and says, hey, we'll take him on and he can make a run with us. Probably not super likely, but once again, not out of the realm of possibility entirely. I also looked at tight ends. I couldn't find a single tight end that made a ton of sense from a pass catching standpoint. Maybe you could, I don't know. I would say maybe Zach Ertz, but his contract's just abysmal. I can't even imagine that. So there's not really a tight end. It would probably have to be a wide receiver if they want to add a pass catcher around the deadline. So realistic, maybe OBJ on a free agent deal midway through the season, maybe a Marvin Jones, maybe a Jarvis Landry. Those I could potentially see. Corey Davis if the Jets take on some of that deal. But there would be some options. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that they could get involved in those conversations if things aren't going according to plan. But that's the scenarios I see maybe going down. I don't see anything in the near future. I don't see anything prior to training camp. Maybe towards the end of camp if Julio's out there and something made sense and you had some injuries. Same thing with OBJ if he was willing to sign now and put him on the PUP list, etc. But I think a mid-season acquisition at wide receiver, if needed, is the much more likely scenario for the Packers. That's going to do it for me today. Thank you for joining me. I'll be right back here tomorrow with an all-new episode. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.